Thank you, Patrick. It's kind of cool. I'm actually back in the same place my daughter graduated last May, so all of my kids went to UBC, which is interesting. I'm probably the only person here without an urban sustainability background, so naturally Patrick asked me to summarize what all the other professionals and thoughtful individuals here said. But I think it's interesting because as a layperson, one has to be a little more aware of the currents without understanding sometimes the deep and thoughtful elements that go into planning a sustainable urban community. And I'll give you an indication for us. It's one of the things to remember, which is quite interesting in this, is that 8 or 9 years ago, this topic of sustainability was so new that very few people actually were even discussing it. And I received a small grant from the University of Southern California to start thinking about what topic would be the next big topic on the Pacific Rim. I worked for Orville Schell at the time. Actually, I worked with Orville Schell at the time at the journalism school at Berkeley. And I asked him, I said, what do you think the topic is that's really going to be the next major focus for the planet, but particularly the Pacific Rim? And he said to me, it was very interesting, he's got a sense of kind of ability to see what comes next better than anybody I've ever known. He said it's going to undoubtedly be the topic of sustainable urban development. He's a journalist, his focus is China. But he said if you look at the forces that are shaping the environment, the influx of individuals into major urban environments, it has to be the next topic. And so I started to do my research on it. And one of the interesting things was that the city of Vancouver, but particularly one professor in Vancouver, emerged consistently. It was a professor who had written a book called 7 Rules for Sustainable Communities. So I tried to contact him, and I sent Patrick, this is the individual Patrick Connick, an email, and predictably he ignored it because, of course, who was I? But the second time he responded, and it was, he basically said, tell me a little more, and I explained it to him. And since that time, Patrick has become one of our most important, I think, advisors on this project to really look at how these forces of urbanization and sustainability together are really shaping the environment now. And it's worth noting, Uwe Brandes here was actually the person. We started out as a small series of conferences in California, and then Uwe brought the Urban Land Institute into this process, and we took the entire process to Asia. So we're very interested actually in how now these forces have come together, and I've gotten just in this one panel, a number of interesting forces that I think I'll point out just briefly and then try and summarize. I won't have 7 rules like Patrick did, but I got at least 5. The first is that Don Limes noted that we need to reshape the urban container to find new and non-traditional strategies, and he noted it might be a messy hybrid. That's interesting because I think that implies that you're working at it while you're doing it. Anita Huberman noted that Surrey is reaching the tipping point rapidly of being the biggest city in British Columbia, something I would tell you that I doubt your average American even has a clue. Wouldn't understand, let alone anybody else in the Pacific Rim. And she also pointed out that it's the city of the future, a city of immigrants, of refugees. Social justice is an important factor, and diversity. Patrick Cotter also noted that the Vancouver model doesn't follow very effectively here. It's not got the same forces at work, it doesn't have the same advantages, but it also has a relatively new palette to try and work from, and that it is seizing that opportunity, which I thought was really quite interesting. Zhuan Wei, my colleague from the Asia Society, originally from Beijing, pointed out that, in fact, there are a number of common themes that run throughout the Pacific Rim, something we've all noted. There's major change in China. Unlike the United States, and to, I think, a lesser degree than Canada, the Chinese government is actually really deeply involved. And one of the things that she didn't really point out, but I will say, is that it has a real interest in doing this because unlike the United States, unlike Canada, which have had a long time to both pollute and then figure it out, China doesn't have a lot of time. It's built these enormous cities, many of which are not terribly livable, and it's got to figure this question out because it's become a serious issue for the Chinese government. It needs to address it. It knows it needs to address it. It comes up in international fora. It is not a hidden topic. The Chinese are not shy about discussing it, but nonetheless, it's an important topic that needs to be addressed, and the forces that are pressuring China now are much more immediate than anything we're dealing with in North America. Our issues are immediate, but theirs are astoundingly immediate. And then finally, Uwe talked about the fact that globalization is here. One of the words he used consistently is authentic culture, and he talked about the importance of civic culture and bringing people together, even from disparate suburbs, which I think is an interesting point to made. And I think one of the things I liked about Uwe's point is that it can happen rapidly. You can make this happen. It doesn't necessarily need to be incremental. It can be holistic, and I think the question is who's going to lead the charge for that. And I think one of the points he made, which resonated strongly with me, is that cities are really a focus for vibrancy and innovation, which is something that I'm actually starting to think a lot about at the Asia Society. I grew up in the Central California, which is a fairly dead cultural area and one that is really suffering right now. And yet, and you go to the coast, it's fascinating. It's a vibrant, my parents live in the city of Stockton, 70 miles, 120 kilometers or so from San Francisco. It's two different worlds. Stockton is a depressed agricultural city with very little to look forward to in the future. San Francisco, you can't even find a place to live that's affordable, many of the same problems Vancouver has. It feels like a different world, and indeed it really is. So what did I take away from this discussion? Well, the first thing, which I see very clearly, is that there is no one size that fits all. And we see that even within our own organization, within the Asia Society. We have an office in Mumbai, we have an office in Shanghai, we have offices in Manila, San Francisco, and our headquarters in New York. Every one of them has different challenges for urbanization. If you're Vancouver, if you're Surrey, you have the luxury of inventing something out of whole cloth. You have a vibrant middle class. You've got a coastal environment that gives you an opportunity to build on the natural advantages of the place. If you're Mumbai, you got the coastal environment, but you really aren't going to take advantage of it. You've got a massive a massive problem with poverty. You can't dispossess enormous numbers of your community, and you've got to somehow build it while trying to take care of what you've got, the infrastructure that you've got. Manila, has a major problem with transport, so does Jakarta. Some advantages, but enormous problems as well. And then you've got cities in China which are being built out of whole cloth, sometimes so fast, too fast, that they actually have to go back and kind of reinvent what they've done. So I think the idea of a messy hybrid, which was mentioned by Don Limes, is actually a really interesting point, because I think in the end that's what everything is going to come down to in some way. The second is that communities have to find their own way. They can't sort of rely on anybody else to show it to them. However, I think they can learn a lot from other cities and experiences. And I think, again, Vancouver has done some really interesting things. Surrey will do some interesting things. I think Canada has a major role to play here. And one of the things I learned from Patrick early on was I shouldn't just look at the United States and Asia. Really what we ought to look at is North America and Asia, because there are some substantial differences between how Canada approaches urban planning and the United States does. There's much more of an emphasis on social justice, on kind of integrating communities in Canada than the United States, and I think those have a role to play, and they're very important. The third is that there's a set of common challenges. Climate change is the most immediate, but everybody has many of these problems. The bad news is we all have the problems. The good news is they can actually be a unifying rather than a divisive element. And in fact, if you look at America's relationship with China right now, one of the few bright spots is the effort to combat climate change and start to work on these problems of urban sustainability, which affect both countries, but particularly an increasing awareness among Americans that what happens in China really does make a difference even in the United States. The fourth is that the Pacific Rim really matters. 50% of the globe's population, 50% of its economic development in the next 50 years is going to be on the Pacific Rim. So it really is the decisive tipping point for the entire planet. And it's one of the reasons we created this initiative, PCSI, was that awareness that Europe's important, we have an office there, North America matters, but the Pacific Rim is really the decisive, I think, the decisive generator of what happens, good or bad, in the next 50 years. And so I think now we're at a decisive moment. And I think, again, as I listen to the discussion today, there's a lot of good ideas here. They deserve to be heard. And I think there's a real role for the city of Vancouver and for the west coast of the United States and Canada to really positively affect the dialogue moving forward. And I'd like to thank Patrick for inviting me and thank all of you for participating. Thank you.